Great. I think we're getting everybody in the door. So we'll be letting a few people in as we get going, but just we're on the hour. So excited to have everybody here. Welcome. I'm Brad McCabe from Sponsor Circle. Great to have you attend our virtual coffee chat today. Really focusing on sponsorship data, sponsorship insights, and the sentiment scoring. So very excited to have Adam here to join us. So Adam Mitchell is with Sponsor Pulse. I guess you're a division of IMI or a spin-off of IMI, but it's great to have that engine of research behind you. So Adam, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Thanks for having me, Brad. It's great to be here and looking forward to chatting and chatting and meeting with some of the other people that are attending. My name is Adam Mitchell. I've been with IMI for just over 3 years now, and really joined at that time to try and shake up the world of insights and sponsorship, seeing that there's clearly a lack of transparency within the space in between properties, brands, and agencies. And also noticing that there's greater pressure on time and on budget for all parties involved, and not really any solution in the data and insight space to alleviate those tension points. So that's really what led us to this point today, where we have a platform that measures 2,000 plus properties across 18 countries on an ongoing basis to be able to arm sponsorship professionals and empower them with the data that they need at the second that they need it. So really excited to chat about sponsorship in general. Obviously, the space is changing every single day, which makes for, I'm sure, everybody on this call or this chat's lives to be quite interesting, and no 2 days are the same. So it's an exciting time to be in sponsorship.
Great. Well, thanks for joining. I mean, we've got always an interesting mix of people coming from the property side, agency, and the brand side. So it should be some interesting questions coming on. We've got a good roster that have come in advance. And if anybody wants to jump in through the conversation, just put a question in the chat, and we'll slip it in for Adam or myself to address. But happy to have this be kind of an open discussion on sponsorship data, sponsorship insights. So what's your approach, Adam, when you're coming and looking at insights and you're sort of assessing a property and how a brand would engage with a property? Where do you start?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, obviously, and we're all seeing it. There's so many new services in the sponsorship space that are all around different parts of the data equation and understanding consumers and what they're doing. I think our stance, and really based off of the core of IMI International's experience and our history, 50 years in the space, is all about the consumer. So we're relentlessly focused on consumer data. So it is survey based. And really, we let all the other players who are really focused on social and on the measurement of brand and logo exposure, we let them kind of do what they're doing and then continue to invest there. But really, our focus is on the consumer. Because we think that there's a balance that's required and that's important in the space to understand what consumers say they feel they do and how they react to sponsorships versus what they actually do online, whether that be through social channels or what they do in terms of their journey whenever they're searching or looking at data information around different properties. So we believe that it's two sides of the coin, and they both are really complementary to one another. So our approach, and when we started out, we really wanted to simplify sponsorship. There are so many metrics, there's so much data out there. A lot of it is media, and I think that there's generally a sense, in having been on both the brand and property side previous to my time at IMI, I think there's generally a sense of not knowing what's real or what's sales spin, and I think that there's probably a perception that is in many ways, I think, reality, that properties are out there kind of pushing, the biggest number or the biggest stat that they have around total fans or total impressions or whatever it may be, and they're totally right to obviously do that, assuming that it's true. But our perspective was, how do we build a model that looks at properties across sport, music, entertainment, lifestyle, culture, cause, that can be the same, so that we can create one common measurement system that allows us to compare the NHL to the Osheaga Music Festival, to the TIFF Festival, to Just for Laughs, to the Canadian Cancer Society, to literally you name it, any property that could be sponsorable. How do we create a model that essentially allows us to instantly compare and provide that context and to level the playing field, frankly, because there are a lot of sponsorship properties that aren't getting their fair share out of the marketplace, and we believe that data and our model certainly helps to level set that and to showcase the reach, the emotion that they generate, and the impact that they can actually create for potential sponsors. So all that to say, we have 7 key metrics that we use. We look at behaviorally, we look at whether people engage with properties from an annual perspective. So have you watched it on TV? Have you watched it online? Do you follow it socially? Do you follow it in the news? Do you recommend it to others? We then get into like the intensity and the velocity, the frequency of that engagement. Do you do it on a weekly basis or more? So are there 50 plus touch points for brands to be able to actually intercept and add value to those who engage with the property? And then we look at momentum. Is it growing? Is it declining? Is it stagnant? And there's some really interesting stuff that comes out when you kind of layer those different behavioral metrics in to one another. Then we look at the emotion side of the equation, given obviously, sponsorship is so, it's such a great opportunity for brands to hone in and to build an emotional connection based off of the fan bases and the engaged bases that these properties have and that they generate and continue to build. So we look at passion versus excitement. And I think one of the things that we always talk about with our methodology is that we don't do scales. We're not into the scale system. We don't do top 2 box. We don't do top 3 box. There's so much gray area in data out there that allows, I think, a lot of people to manipulate the data to tell the story that they want to tell. We ask yes, no questions. If you can't tell us that you're passionate about the property, then you're not passionate about it. If you can't tell us that you're excited by it, then you're not excited by it. So we don't work in the gray area because we want to be conservative. We want to be realistic. And we want to make sure that we are providing properties and brands with very tangible, real, actionable data that can support their decision making. And then the final piece of the bottom of our funnel is really, can you convert? In this case, or for Canada, are Canadian consumers going to be purchasing more of your product? Are they going to be more favorable towards your brand if you sponsor this property? So 7 key metrics, we roll those into one score, which we call our opportunity score, which is kind of that instant one number. If you need a quick answer, is it bigger, the same, smaller than another opportunity from a valuation perspective? You've got that shortcut. But those 7 metrics apply to 2,000 properties that we can essentially cut, slice and dice in thousands of different ways to help paint the picture that's going to be most useful in simplifying and making a decision to go, no go, to pursue, or to negotiate further, or whatever the business challenge might be at that time.
Yeah, and that sentiment piece is just, I think it's really a great approach, and it's puts the audience first. Because I started in sponsorship, and I remember the old IAG valuation calculator, and I would sit there and churn out, okay, this is bringing $400,000 worth of value, and I go to the sponsor and okay, so we're going to give it to you for 40 grand, and they're like, well, what's the deal with this 400,000 thing you're throwing at me? Because they'd always question the validity of the data, and it's the spacing. It would say, okay, well, one person coming through the door is between 25 cents and $15. There's so much gray area to play with in some of those calculators. It's interesting that you've kind of taken all of that out and to say, okay, what's the justification for investing in this audience?
It's such an interesting thing. I mean, I'd love to hear your perspective and other perspectives on it. I mean, valuation of properties has become and continues to be like one of the biggest opportunity areas, I think, in sponsorship space, because it's so difficult to do right. And there's not one perfect methodology. I think one of the things that we've been working on and that we've been doing a lot more work on as of late with brands and properties is actually we've built a model that essentially values a property based off of that consumer data that we have. So we've taken those 7 metrics, we built a model based off of our benchmarking that says, okay, based off of the consumers, based off of your momentum, based off of the likelihood to convert, we can tell you, generally speaking, what that investment range should be. And that's, we like drown out the noise that exists from politics, from exclusivity, from all the factors that frankly can take the property value from $1 to $100 in the negotiation and the way that things all play out in real life, so to speak. But we start with that consumer perspective to help ground the negotiation, to help ground the discussion, because then we're all starting from a common understanding of, we know how many people engage, we know all the way down the funnel to how many will convert, and we can agree that that's worth roughly somewhere in between X and Y. Now let's talk about what the asset mix is. Let's talk about what the package includes and what the value of those assets are. So a lot of it is like, let's agree, create that level playing field, and then put the swords away so that we can get to specifically the really important stuff, which is, what are the assets? How are we going to activate to make sure that we actually generate the value that the property and that the relationship should be able to generate? So it's obviously, if anybody had the silver bullet to answer that question, they'd be doing quite well, I'm sure. But we feel that we feel and we've seen that it has been a really useful tool for properties of all sizes and for brands as well, because the methodology is entirely transparent. There's if a brand and a property ask us to value the property, like, we come back with the same result because it's based off of consumer data. So it's a great way to at least kind of level set and to create some boundaries in that discussion on what are we actually worth. So I think that's a really exciting and interesting thing that I think the industry at large is going to see more of, is how do we use data, consumer and otherwise. And you can see it already with all the great things that are happening on the social and the media measurement side of, people are saying your exposure is worth X or Y based off of, how much time and the quality and so on and so forth. So I think that, we're going to start seeing that, and we're certainly going to be pushing into that space more and more to be able to leverage consumer data to help influence and advise people and inform people on what properties are actually worth.
Yeah, and just from our engagement with Sponsor Pulse to date and being able to review some of the data, it's really interesting looking at it, because I know from the valuation scores, and you go, okay, it's X value for a logo on the shirts, and it's X value for our advertising, down to how much is it going to be for sampling. But then you get the always the intangible. What's the plus on the value of who we are as an organization that differentiates from another organization? And it really feels like the approach that you've brought from Sponsor Pulse that sort of tackles that piece.
Well, here's the thing: is like a property changes, and that can be good, bad, or indifferent. Generally speaking, it's good. Like, for a lot of properties, they grow year over year. So our methodology and the way that we look at valuing a property accounts for the fact that you're growing, because we measure it. We're in market and field every single month. So if you have momentum, if you're doing new things and engaging new audiences, we're capturing that, and your value goes up accordingly. So setting the table and having a system and a measurement system valuation model that says this is roughly what we're worth today, we continue to measure the property and its success and its journey, so to speak, and the value will likely, in most cases, not all cases, will continue to accelerate and increase based off of the investments being made by the property to engage new fan bases or to bring more people into the franchise. So it's dynamic in that sense, because it is data based and because we're constantly in field collecting new information. So we feel it provides a pretty interesting lens into that discussion, which I think for so many years has been really a black box. And I think that, I think most people would agree. And I would love to have the debate is, like, there's a lot of waste in sponsorship. And that's not me saying or knocking sponsorship. I think that's probably pretty clear. I believe in the power of sponsorship holistically, but that doesn't mean that the dollars that are currently being spent are optimal, or that the properties getting the lion's share of the spend are necessarily where they should be going, because properties across different passion points definitely offer different opportunities to engage and to drive impact. So I think that's a lot of what our approach is to try and level set the playing field and give people the information that they need to make informed decisions.
No, and I think one comment I've heard from someone else, actually, Daniel Oyston down in Australia, he was talking about the value of just having your logo on the field. And you're talking about waste, is would you ever buy a 30-second commercial and just put your logo out there and not put any context to it? And I think that becomes the same thing if you're just putting your logo on the field. What other activations are you doing to actually bring that to the consumer? Because it could be significantly wasted investment.
Totally, and I think another huge issue for the sports space, specifically as it pertains to valuing assets that are like visible in broadcast, is that largely the properties selling those assets and valuing those assets don't control the broadcast. So what happens if the reins get, or if the rug gets pulled out from under them, and all of a sudden there's new rules, or all of a sudden the overarching governing body takes control of those assets, or the broadcasters want more line share of the value of those assets. So it's a slippery slope, and I think that's why it's such an exciting time in the sponsorship space, because it's changing every day, and obviously there's a lot to be considered, and the way in which that things are packaged, sold, and valued is going to continue to evolve for sure over the next 5-10 years, as things kind of get ironed out with the wars for rights to actual games and to footage and to live competition, and obviously the competition heats up with new categories entering the space, like cryptocurrency, like literally storming onto the scene. Obviously, people have probably seen the recent deal that TSM did with FTX in the US. I mean, there's huge money being spent in the space, and with money and with that investment, there's going to be a growing need for sharpening the pencil and ensuring that there's data informing those investments for sure.
And one of the conversations we've had with a lot of the partners we work with is that you can't necessarily value the sponsor consistently across brand verticals. The value that your audience has for a financial company is very different from an auto company, very different from a CPG. So saying that, okay, this sponsorship is $100,000 investment, you can't necessarily justify that against every single brand. So when you're looking at it from Sponsor Pulse or from your own view, do you have variations for, it's got one score for one vertical and a different score for another vertical?
Yeah, like when it comes to our consumer data, we can cut it so many different ways. We have, every demo, we've got 67 categories. So if you wanted to look at, people who are purchasing crypto, or people who are purchasing tires, or people who are purchasing paper products, or whatever it may be, short or long-term categories, we've got them. So that really helps in terms of like narrowing and getting to a clearer picture and vision as to like what is the opportunity. I think when it comes to properties, a lot of what we do is we actually created a view that allows us to look at one single property across all categories and to show where the over-index is. So we can essentially shortcut and say, this is your best hit list, because these are the best storylines that you have that are super targeted, and that will allow you to deliver a really custom narrative about, this is where your customer or where your customers are. So we certainly look at it across those different elements, and category being really obviously important. We also have been tracking brands. So one of the exciting things that we're coming out with shortly is looking at specifically, the intersection of a property with a brand, and almost more importantly, a property and a competitor brand. So in theory, using examples, but if Coca-Cola versus Pepsi is the conversation, and you're representing one of those brands, if you want to go and retain your current client base, you'd be interested in knowing where they are. But if you want to go acquire new client bases, you'd be more interested in seeing where your competitors' client bases are from a property perspective. So lots of different nuances and ways that we can look at the data to make, once again, it's like simplifying the decision-making process based off of what the objective is at the forefront. And then I think when it comes to value and translating that data into valuation, short-term, long-term categories, of course it changes. The long tail of, an insurance company or a bank or an automotive company, like it's not, attribution of sponsorship to purchasing a car isn't happening overnight. It's a lot easier to justify that, or to rationalize that for a chocolate bar or for cereal or shorter term categories. But I think that's why the valuation space is so dynamic, and for those reasons, there's a lot of work being done on trying to prove the media value and the exposure, because that's a currency that's on the street. If I'm an automotive player and my options are to go buy media across a series of networks and platforms, great. That's my own message in all those channels. I know what that costs. I know how many impressions I'll get. But on the flip side, what's the alternative? The alternative is sponsorship. And so we use, I think there's a lot of that, and we've seen a lot of big players that are storming onto the scene, giving, what is the value of the social impressions or of the impressions that are being generated from the sponsorship, because it's the currency right now. It's the most common currency that people can literally compare and transact on, and that they transact on daily, which just, I think, simplifies, or at least makes it a bit more of an apples to apples comparison. So is sponsorship going to be as efficient? No, it shouldn't be. You should be paying for the privilege to associate your brand to some of these properties that have built up equity. But it certainly gives you a starting point as to, this is our baseline and what the cost per thousand is right now. And then this is what I'm paying incrementally for the ability to tap into an engaged fan base and to create exclusive content and to be featured within it. So I think those are the dynamics at play that are certainly getting more complicated before they get more simple. That's for sure.
Well, and I think that's where you start getting into the discussions about reach, and then reach with relevance. So we talk about sponsorship being potentially inefficient, but if you're buying digital ads or you're buying traditional media, you can get reach and you can buy that audience. But the end recipient of your advertising really doesn't have any context put around it. So then all of a sudden, if you're at a game and you see a brand there, then you start feeling that affinity. I think about NASCAR, and there was a study by a professor at the University of Minnesota, and he followed stock prices, and he looked at the week after any event happened to see what happened with the stock prices. And for NASCAR, if the brand's NASCAR won a big race, the stock price went up and the sales of its products went up really significantly. And that's just something you can't get from having an ad on TV.
It's a tough one. I mean, I think everybody on this call, everybody probably on the planet saw and has heard about like the Ronaldo Coca-Cola bottle aqua thing, and some of the responses. I mean, IKEA went out with their Cristiano bottle, with like lots of smart things that are happening. But I think that I'm not underplaying Ronaldo's prominence, relevance in the world. We know and we track a lot of celebrities, and he's got pretty close to, like, I think it was 95% awareness across Europe when we had done the study on him across several countries, which is probably not that surprising, but 95%, like that's like, presidential status, if not greater than. So it's a pretty significant, obviously, he's a very significant person in the world. But to say that his actions directly impacted and drove a $4 billion loss in value for Coca-Cola, like, I think that's completely outrageous. His little action, and it's not just a little action, but to say that that's actually the driving force of the stock price of Coca-Cola, I think is probably taking a bit of a leap. And if anybody followed their stock price in the days following, I mean, like, it's Coca-Cola, like their stock price changes the way that the market changes. So I think it's interesting because there's a lot of people that are out there trying to prove or to understand whether there is a direct relationship between like actual shareholder value and sponsorship or performance. I think there's definitely a relationship, but do we really think that sponsorship or the impact of a player or a team or a league can drive that kind of immediate change in value? I don't know. I don't know that we have enough research to say one way or the other. But I don't believe, or I'm not personally a believer that that Ronaldo's actions were a driver of that stock price decrease. I think it's just a very important reminder that for properties, be careful with what you're offering, and for brands, be careful what you're buying. A lot of people are calling BS on BS. So I think it's forcing people to get a bit more creative, which is a good thing. We all could stand to be a bit more creative and thoughtful with how we're integrating and what we're offering to brands, and the way that brands are, translating their purpose or their role in the world into the sponsors or the properties that they're involved with.
And the Ricardo piece it's an interesting one, because yes, it was somewhat negative, an action against the sort of the feel and the delivery and the benefits of the sponsorship. But I saw a good write-up by Ricardo Ford, who had just recently exited as the global lead for sponsor for Coke. And he was saying, yeah, okay, there was a stock hit, but we had more conversation about that and Coke, and more mentions about the alliance that they had and the sponsor they had with UEFA that they would never have gotten anywhere else. So the value of the sponsorship actually just went through the roof as a result of it.
Yeah, different ways to skin the cat, right? Like I think lots of different perspectives, and that I totally like. I get that, and would certainly agree. There's probably very few people out there that are questioning, who the soft drink sponsor of UEFA is at this point in time. So I guess he's taking it or coming at it from the point of no publicity is bad publicity. But it's interesting, right? I mean, because the alignment between, and I think it begs a question, and we talk about this a lot, between like, do you sponsor the league or do you sponsor the team? Do you sponsor the team or do you sponsor the player? And there's a lot of different ways to look at that relationship in terms of like, where's the greatest influence? And particularly in the world of football or soccer, there's a lot of interesting storylines that unfold where teams are larger than the leagues or the tournaments that they play in, and players can be larger than the teams that they play on and the leagues that they play on or play in. So it certainly is another layer that, obviously, with the rise of investment in athletes and in endorsement deals, that I think is going to continue to evolve over the coming time. I mean, I think I saw something around the top earners this past year, and I think Federer was on there, and I'm a huge Roger Federer fan, love the guy, just like a pure class act and what an athlete. But I think he had made something like $90 million in the last year, and he had not played like a single match until recently because he was nursing, a couple of surgeries. So it's just it's a fascinating space that it adds a layer of complexity in terms of what your options are from a brand perspective, and then from a property lens is like, players and those people who represent you, whether it's athletes or whether it's musicians or whoever it may be, spokespeople, like they're as important a piece of the puzzle as any other. So the nuances and how those relationships work, I think, is something that's still obviously changing. And I think the brands out there and the properties out there that are at the forefront are thinking of ways where or ways to ensure that there's value exchanged at that player representative ambassador level. That benefits both the property and building it and the brand in building their relationship and awareness with the property.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about sort of the different elements that are dynamic when it comes to investment and sponsorship and what the value then comes out of it. The Ricardo Coke piece, and then you've got the Heineken element that just happened last week, and I think about what happened in the bowl game earlier this year. I had no idea what Duke's Mayo was until one of the bowl champions dropped the trophy, and then they duct taped a Duke's Mayo bottle to the top of the trophy because they were the sponsor of the bowl game. But that just all of a sudden went viral that this guy was running around with that. So when you're doing the sentiment tracking you do, does that come into play to start changing the value of it?
Yeah, so I think it does. So I think there's our methodology and the way that we approach it is very consistent. We do a lot of ad hoc tracking on actual in-market impact and effectiveness, cost effectiveness, ROI, so on and so forth. So we do a lot of that stuff that's ad hoc based off of client need. But what we do in our kind of bread and butter in the landscape of understanding the landscape is consistent. It's every month. So we definitely see changes over time. But I think the methodology and a big part of it is we want to drown out the outliers and some of that noise, because at the end of the day, a lot of these sponsorship deals are being signed for 3, 5, 10, 20 years now. And so ensuring that we're not making or providing data that is simply a reflection of what happened yesterday, because there's a lot of other players out there that are doing that, frankly, and valuing and telling you how much exposure it generated and how many people saw it and engaged with it and so on and so forth. Our role is really to represent the consumer's voice holistically and over time, as opposed to just a dip here and say, oh, there's a lot of buzz for this property or that property because something happened. That's great to know, and it's super relevant, obviously, to any discussion around potentially sponsoring it. But is that actually the headline? You should really understand what the base is and what the size of the opportunity is first, and then the context of what's happening today is obviously a critical component. But we think that it's always important to ground yourself in understanding the size of the opportunity first and foremost.
And I know, part of the work that you're doing starts involving themes and topics. So the overarching theme of environment or youth sport.
Yeah.
How do you score that as a generic theme, and then within it, how do the different properties start aligning?
Yeah, so when we set out and build the model, we basically said, like, listen, there's a massive gap in between what a top sport league has budget wise to build its fan base and the exposure that they get just by virtue of being on TV every night, versus a cause or a charity or a music festival or whatever it may be. So for that reason, we built a model that looked at engagement over past 12 months so that we understood whether people have engaged with the property over a 12-month period of time. And then we dig deeper from there to understand what the nuances are. I think from a causal perspective specifically, we look at and we measure, I think it's roughly 45 different causal territories. So, like, as you said, environment, protecting endangered species, cancer research and support. And then we also measure charities that correspond to some of those causal territories and that go beyond. And the reason for that is that I think a lot of charities out there struggle to deliver a compelling narrative in the marketplace that says this is actually how many people we engage and our importance in the marketplace and what it can mean for your brand. So we thought the territory level would give us a great indicator of the actual size of the opportunity that some of those territories represent, recognizing that a lot of brands out there are actually starting to pursue or develop their own initiatives that are not tied to charities, but that are at least starting to move them into that space and being obviously strong corporate citizens and contributing positively to communities that they operate in. So it's a really interesting dynamic to be able to go into any discussion and to immediately showcase that, yes, the NHL is a top property in Canada across most, not all, but most filters that you can apply, demo, category, whatever it may be. But recycling is right up there. Protecting endangered species is right up there. If you look at, among 13 to 18-year-olds, anti-bullying is the second biggest opportunity from our tracking. Like, that's literally of any opportunity. So, like, there's a lot of really interesting nuances that I think force or provide the opportunity to, like, reflect and say, okay, sport definitely provides the greatest reach. I think that's pretty obvious. And that's where the lion's share of the money is being spent. But when it comes to impact and the ability to actually translate engagement into impact and positively impacting your business, charities and causes are light years ahead of all the others. Where they fall short is the reach component. So a lot of what we end up talking about when we talk to different brands and properties is like, there is a really interesting formula here where if you can combine the reach of a sport property with the purpose and the impact of a cause, and you can be the brand that's making it happen, that's a pretty powerful trifecta. And I think that we've started to see, NHL Fights Cancer. You have the NFL that does their breast cancer awareness month. There's a lot of different properties out there that are starting to move into that space. And I think that there's brands that are starting to try to find their way to leverage the reach and intensity, the frequency of that reach and the exposure that a property can build, but to bring along a really important piece of that discussion, which is around causes and charities, and being able to actually bring all those things together to create, I think the holy grail, or certainly a greater impact overall. But yeah, that's a lot of the dynamics at play is, just because sports is where the money is and where there's a lot of reach doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be the greatest opportunity for impact. But it means that there's more creativity, more work likely involved in figuring out how we're going to generate the reach that we need for a partnership with a cause or with a charity to get the air that it needs to be able to generate that impact. So is it more work? Yeah. But is it worth the work? Like, absolutely. We have the data to prove that. And then obviously the bonus is that it's, their dollars being spent on actually improving the world that we live in and contributing in a meaningful way. So we're huge advocates, and personally, I think that's just, there's some brands out there that are starting to do it more and more, and trying to find those opportunities. they're not always obvious. It's not just sign on the dotted line and send us a check. This is your media exposure. We have to work at this, and it's going to take time to develop the ideas and for those ideas to really take off and to build momentum. But you're playing a long game, and I think that the brands that are moving into that space are certainly going to be the ones that reap the benefits, as they continue to invest and build equity in ownable programs that are actually driving change.
Yeah, I can certainly see that. I mean, thinking about Sun Life and their investment in diabetes and support of diabetes for years, and then they brought that to their engagement with the Raptors, with the shirt patch and
totally.
Everything else that they've been doing. Definitely, that was brand driven, or I'm assuming it was brand driven. But do you find is that the consistent driver, or do you find that sometimes you've got the sport, the team is looking for a CSR engagement, then they're bringing the partners on and bringing the property on?
I think it goes both ways. Like I'm not saying like there's a lot of sport properties out there that are looking to actually to create meaningful impact. I think most of them, if not all of them, they all should be out there thinking about that. But I think a lot of them are, and then are finding the synergies in between their partners or prospective partners to try to highlight, what they can do when they pool their resources together. And that's a really exciting legacy piece, I think, when you think of, being involved in the sponsorship space and finding a way to combine the assets at play to create meaningful change. I think is just, it's a really, one, it's obviously purposeful and exciting to work on, but also there's a huge legacy component of these programs can live on well beyond the cycle of somebody's career with any one organization. So I think that there's a lot of meaning, a lot of impact there that can be had within sponsorship. And having or thinking about things differently and having the data to help justify and say, like, this is why we have to consider this, I think is a helpful component to that storyline for sure.
And thinking of the data that you're providing, where does somebody start? If you're a property and you're looking at all the data that Sponsor Pulse has, how do you start incorporating that into your offering or how you're presenting yourself to?
Yeah, I think our focus, as I said, with like early on, like 7 metrics. I'm not going to bore people with any more about what they are, but like the point of the metrics is to help tell your story. Tell people how many people you engage. Tell people that you've got momentum. Highlight the excitement, the passion that you have. Highlight the fact that you can create impact. It's all about creating that funnel in a very logical, rational way that is going to help reinforce, what the type of opportunity is. So I think that certainly is a great starting point. I think the ability to then also understand where you're at relative to the market and what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, is just super helpful. We're out there collecting the data every month, so you'll know month over month whether things are changing year over year, whether things are moving in the right direction or not. But we can help you identify where your gaps are, where your strengths are. I think one of the really interesting, which is not going to be like crazy surprising to anybody, but if you look at like the NBA and the Toronto Raptors, and you look at that next to like the NHL, for example, in Canada, and you look at the trajectory of what has happened nationally, obviously with the championship win and the run, like incredible the growth that the NBA has seen from leveraging and kind of like piggybacking on the success of the Toronto Raptors. If you then cut that and look at it among 13 to 18-year-olds in Canada, like it's wild. The Toronto Raptors have become like the #1 property in Canada, like literally surpassing the NHL. Like it's fascinating to see that kind of change in the way that the market is evolving. So being able to say, we have obviously a great history and we just won a championship. We're going through, the changes that we're going through with the team and how we're rebuilding some components, but like, this is our story. We know that our sweet spot is not just a great national story, but that we're really, honing in on and capitalizing and connecting with this younger fan base, like being able to add that layer to the storyline that's rooted in fact, and then enhancing that with, and this is the plan that we have to continue to dominate in this space and to continue to recruit new and to drive that fan base. It just helps provide context, both internally from a strategy, where are we going and why, but I think also externally in terms of trying to communicate effectively with partners as to what actually is the crux of the opportunity that you're offering. So I think that's a lot of it is manipulating and playing with the data through filters to understand where your strengths, weaknesses lie. And I mean, we're always I think a big part of our model and our methodology and who we are is it's transparency. We would always advise a property to wear it, where your where your strengths and where your weaknesses, the same. Own your weaknesses and develop a plan to go and to focus on them. And the fact that you have that self-awareness, I think, immediately drives credibility with your potential partners, and it also just sets you up for greater success long term.
And even the Raptors is a great example, and the fact that you're scoring sentiment on an ongoing basis. Have you seen a shift in a brand like that because they were so big 2 years ago, and now they're starting to rebuild and figure out where they're going? They missed the playoffs for the first time in ages. Does their score come down as a result of that? Yeah,
we'll certainly on an individualized metric perspective, we'll certainly see some nuances. But that said, I think once again, there's so much for the right reasons. There's so much news, and there's so much that is spun in the news. And I'm not saying that it's not factual, but there's a lot out there that is trying to indicate one way or another. But the reality from a consumer's perspective is that if I've engaged with the Raptors once in the past year, or 52 times in the past year, them not making the championships is not going to have an immediate adverse impact on me. I am still an engaged part of that property. I am still accessible to a brand that is looking to potentially invest there. We do see changes on some of the motion metrics. I mean, the excitement level that the Winnipeg Jets have is off the charts, tops around the globe of all of the properties that we track across all passion points. But think about it. I mean, despite their performance, they've been largely a playoff team, but they were a team that was then taken away from the province, that was then reintroduced, and the excitement shows. So that doesn't mean that there aren't fans that are livid with their exit, but excitement for the team is something that is relatively consistent. There are ebbs and flows as they perform that we certainly track and measure, but our goal isn't to provide. Our goal is to provide a very balanced assessment of what the opportunity looks like and what it presents, but not to knee-jerk based off of just recency or what's happened lately or over the past week or month.
No, and I think that ongoing metric becomes it's an interesting thing. If you get a brand who's turning around and go, okay, where do we fit in? Because you haven't been as successful, maybe you're not as valuable. We should pay as much for the sponsorship.
Totally. And the flip side of that is sorry, getting back to, I think your question around the Raptors, I mean, the gains that they produced as they made their championship run, we're looking double-digit increases kind of across the board. So getting in early with a property that has a lot of potential or that you buy into in terms of the storyline and the narrative. I mean, I think of the Ottawa Senators, not that they're necessarily a top property in Ontario, frankly, from the tracking, not from personal opinion, but they've got some amazing pieces of the puzzle that are starting to come together. Right? I mean, they've got some incredible talent, and as that talent continues to build, as they continue to invest, I think there's a really interesting story there that, some partners who have either been legacy and involved for a long time, or some partners who are looking at them saying, we believe that there's a future here. You're going to be able to ride the coattails of that momentum. And we have data to help support, what's it worth today, and knowing that when they reach that pinnacle, hopefully, it's going to be worth a lot more. And we can help kind of provide guidance on what that trajectory looks like from both the properties and brands perspective.
I sat in on a discussion from the head of partnerships for the Chicago Bulls just 2 years ago. And the Bulls haven't been good for the last couple of years. And in the discussion, they had their partner from BMO there, who's been heavily invested in the Bulls for a number of years. And one thing that the Chicago Bulls have done is they've created a dashboard. So every engagement point, every activation they do is fully visible on this dashboard that the brands can come in and see. So they can see when the social posts come out, see all the metrics behind it. It's really transparent. And it became this discussion point for them to say, yes, we didn't make the playoffs, but we've given you so much value over the year. So that people could justify the continued investment even though there was poor performance.
Totally. I mean, I think the ability to track and to be at the forefront of that, and I mean, I'm not undermining. I think the investment that's likely made to be able to track all those connection points is probably pretty significant. But I think it's an important part of the equation. Obviously, at the end of the day, you want to be able to capitalize and to be a part of the journey or the road to a championship or to whatever the pinnacle of whatever the property is, right? But it doesn't mean that there's no value there, even when the team isn't necessarily performing well. I think it forces greater creativity and thinking differently about how do you activate or what storylines do you want to be a part of if a deep playoff run isn't in the question. So yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's great to see that there's a lot of properties out there that are starting to make data have data sit at the forefront so that they're prepared for those discussions when partners are like, we want you to win. And I mean, there are obviously elements that they control, but not all elements. So no, I think it's definitely a forward-looking and progressive. It's where the world of sponsorship is certainly going.
And where do you find brands start to engage with you? Are they looking at it from the outset before they start investing in any element when they're doing the full strategy piece, or are they trying to do it to measure the impact of their current investments?
A bit of both. I think like from a portfolio perspective, I think a lot of because of a lot of like legacy deals that have been signed for God knows how long, there's a lot of money that's like either being invested in sponsorships and it's like, oh, we need to like look at this from a different perspective and get data to justify like, is it incremental? Is it not? Are we hitting the same people through all these different avenues that are all, cost to the business? What's the optimal portfolio? What is the optimal portfolio mix? So I think brands are definitely, there are some that are asking those questions that are really around, where should we go? And how do we build a portfolio that's going to be able to, reach our core target in different places? And I think people, it's not as simple as it seems. Like somebody who is going to buy a auto part isn't necessarily only engaging with NASCAR, right? Like, or with racing properties. Like that is the most obvious connection. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be there, certainly, but like that makes sense. Contextually makes sense. But where else can you be? Where else could you intercept those people is, I think, a huge part of the equation that we try to provide value in, because we can then look at, okay, relatively speaking, you're in X number of racing properties, great. What are those costing you? And then over here, from a causal perspective or from an arts and culture perspective, we know that your client base is here, and the cost of entry is going to be usually a fraction of the size of getting involved in more sport properties. So I think there's a lot of the portfolio planning stuff that some of our clients and partners use our data to help inform. And then I think a lot of it is it working? So we have a product that looks at in-market effectiveness that allows us to look at, awareness and impact and breakthrough, which is, I think, one, it's great because it's a baseline. It's super accessible from a timing perspective. It's quick. From a cost perspective, it's very efficient. But properties and brands use it to help understand, like, is it working? And especially when renewals come around, having that information, knowing that they're on the right track or that things are moving in the right direction is critical. And I think with a lot of new partnerships that are being struck, we're out there and we're obviously promoting and saying, like, start from a common understanding of like, what is the baseline today? And then let's continue to measure it over time, whether that's with us or otherwise. It's just smart business. You want to know where you're starting, and you want to be able to show from both the property and the brand side that it is working. And if it's not working, then let's have the conversation and figure out how we change the mix. But I think we're seeing a lot of properties start to build that into their partnership deals, and a lot of brands either investing on their own to have the data so they can make informed decisions, or pushing to ensure that there is, escalators are based off of mutually agreed upon objectives that are met, not based off of just an escalator being plus X% every year. You're paying for the privilege to be a partner, but the escalators and the growth of that partnership should be based on objectives and on reaching those objectives, not just based on, a number or a percentage kind of pulled out of the air.
Yeah, and it's, you always get that challenge of everybody can spin the numbers to make it look appropriate. So we've been really excited to partner with Sponsor Pulse here at Sponsor Circle and bring your data in and make it part of the property displays that we've got and be able to showcase those extra levels of value and what those categories of individual properties have. So I mean, we're advocates of it, and it's just a matter of getting people to understand where they can come in and the different engagement points. I know that this is getting into a bit of a sales pitch for you, but you've really kind of made it accessible for people to get full value, that they're not having to put out for a large, not to knock Environics or Nielsen, but those can be pretty expensive and not everybody's budget.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like we have the data. The data is in our system, in our database, and we want people to be able to use it because we believe that sponsorship decisions should be simple, but we believe that they should be fact-based, and we believe that they should be influenced by data from the consumer as one of the key components, not the only component. And that's why we've made a big bet on that, right? I mean, we've been collecting data since July 2018 across North America, since September 2019 across 16 other countries, so that we can provide that data seamlessly to people who need it. And we're also believers that people who are representing properties or brands, like your property and brand better than we ever will, or than we ever should. So let's empower you. Let's give you the data, get you what you need so that you can make those decisions and move your business forward without pricing the product or the data based on who you are or your company size. I mean, the transparency of our pricing and our subscription model, everything, like it's core to who we are and to what we do and to how we put ourselves out there, so that it is accessible, and so that we're not pricing you because you're a major sport league versus a smaller local charity or local event. The price is accessible to everybody because we believe that having a common currency of sponsorship measurement that reflects the consumer's voice is critical for the entire industry at large. And the sooner that we can get to a point where there is a currency that people can understand, transact, and discuss, I think that'll be a huge game changer for the industry and for saving time, frankly, for properties and for brands as they look to evaluate new opportunities and decide on where they want to invest their money and their time and resources to be in the sponsorship space.
And then you've mentioned a couple of times you've got data coming in from different countries, but is the strength just in the Canadian market, or have you got solid footing in the US market or Australian or UK?
Yeah, I mean, so because we're based in Toronto, we certainly have obviously a pretty significant foothold in the Canadian sponsorship landscape. However, from a data collection perspective, we have data that is huge across all of the countries that we operate in and that we collect in. So I think where a lot of people are concerned about like sample sizes and are they too big, are they too small? Like, one, we're transparent. We show you the sample size on the platform for any cut, any filter that you look at. But two, because we've been collecting since July 2018, there's a lot that you can do with the data because we've got 50,000+ Canadians who have engaged with the NHL, for example. So think of all the different ways that you can cut that over that aggregated database, and then you can look at it based on different time periods and so on and so forth. Lots of different things you can do, but we have that same level of or same robust data set in all the other countries that we operate in. The only difference is that we started in North America about a year prior to going global across the others, which was largely in response to a lot of the partners in North America saying, we want to know how we're doing in Europe or in Asia. Obviously, there's a huge movement, and I think it will continue with a lot of different sports teams, leagues in particular, setting up satellite offices or new offices in different locations to build fan bases. We just saw the NFL announce that they're looking at whether they're likely going to have their next international series football game in Germany, which is really interesting. Huge opportunity. They're one of the European countries that we track in. Germany is like one of the lowest from an engagement perspective. Interesting, right? Like there's obviously, they have a lot of data that supports why they would go to Germany beyond our data, but it certainly helps paint a picture of what the opportunity and the size of the opportunity could be by tapping into new markets. So it just helps provide another lens, another piece of context to the global story that a lot of properties are focused on.
And I think it's sometimes thinking about where those other markets are. I remember with Richard Petty from FC Barcelona, and he was talking about over 95% of their fans will never set foot on the property, will never be in the stadium, but 90% of their sponsor engagement is all in stadium. So they've been trying to figure out how do they access this worldwide, sentiment and engagement for their sport. And then, yeah, you start seeing these new offices for partnerships developing in New York for them for a whole American market.
Totally. I mean, I think that's the way that it's going to continue to move, because a lot of the properties that we're looking at are global. And whether we think they are or not, they are. There are fan bases for the Raptors all over the world. There are fan bases for world table tennis all over the world. There are, fan bases for any of the football or soccer clubs all over the world. So I think it's the globalization of sponsorship and the opportunities that exist for brands to capitalize, for global brands to capitalize on, building their relevance across the world, but also for properties to be able to extract value out of the different pockets that they've earned the right to extract value out of. I think is a really, really interesting part of where we're obviously headed.
I'm just picking up on a couple of questions people put up. I'm having a great conversation here, but want to make sure we address a couple of these questions. I mean, somebody said, what are the top 5 recommendations you would put out to a brand or to a property for positioning themselves?
I mean, top 5. I think one, I would say start with the data. Start with the data or start with clear objectives, obviously, from your brand or your property's perspective. But then let the data take you and guide you through that story arc. So understanding what your priorities are, what you're trying to accomplish, either as a property or a brand. And when I say property, I mean both commercially, but also from an internal property perspective and your growth. Having a really clear picture of where you think your growth opportunities are, and letting the data help inform you is a critical component of that. The second thing I'd say is personally, and this is just a personal point of view, is be honest, be transparent, it adds credibility to your storyline. It makes it easier for people to work with you, where are the things that you do well and where are the things that you're not doing as well equally and with the same amount of pride. Just build a plan to address how you're going to address those different opportunity areas. And then beyond that, I think it comes down to the partnership philosophy or approach. I think so much the data is going to get you so far, but I think that the approach in terms of how you manage a partnership and work with people, how you create common goals, how you ensure that there's a process in place where what success looks like. Those are so pivotal and critical to the success of any partnership. So I think having that transparent, open-minded approach and setting kind of the path forward is important. And I'm not saying it's about the Canadian market in particular, but across the world and across a lot of the different partnerships that we work with, we hear very often that the partnership has not gone the way that people have planned from both the brand and the property side, or that one property or one brand feels that they've been taken advantage of, or that they've been treated unfairly, or that this is happening more than it is not. So I think that there's certainly a very human element to partnerships and to the way that people work together that's critical. And once the data kind of tells you what the data tells you and a deal is struck, I think the rest is really comes down to the human connection and ensuring that there's a goal alignment in between the different parties involved.
Yeah, certainly a lot of the tracking I see from Norm O'Reilly's Canadian landscape study and now the global landscape study, you start seeing that servicing and reporting, there's a big gap between expectations and delivery.
Yeah, and to be I'll be completely transparent here. We hear a lot from properties and brands. If we in traditional, or a lot of the work that we'll pitch on or that we'll talk to clients about, a lot of clients end up just saying, we don't have the time, we don't have the money, right? It's it's research. We've already decided we're going to invest here, so we're going to invest. We'll do research maybe next year or the year after or whatever, and that's fine. Don't get me wrong, but I think that there is certainly the importance of data and grounding decisions in fact is becoming the standard. And I don't know how anybody can sign off on a 6-figure deal, let alone a 7 or 8-figure deal, without having data to back up, why we're doing it and why it's a strategic fit. So I think it's just going to continue to grow in importance over the years to come. And our goal and our mandate is to make it accessible and to democratize access to it so that it's accessible to everybody, no matter your size, scale, or scope.
My advice to any partnership, any property I've worked with, is the person who's giving you the money has to justify to their boss why they invested that. So that having that transparency, having that ability to showcase what you're doing, just make sure that, one, they're going to be secure in their job, and ideally you're trying to get them promoted and be successful.
Everybody wants to look good.
Fantastic. Well, Adam, really appreciate your time today. Very excited by the relaunch of Sponsor Pulse with the new engagement. We do have that incorporation into what we're doing here at Sponsor Circle. So feel free to look at your properties. There's been some changes to that. If you haven't done it already, it's been incorporated and set up a profile on our site. It's been incorporated into a recommender engine. So there's some really great elements that we've been able to bring forward. So it's been an exciting partnership for us, and always appreciate what IMI and Dawn bring to the table, and then now with Sponsor Pulse, you and Eddie and the team. So it's been fantastic to have everybody here, and I'll leave the last words to you, Adam.
Yeah, no, thank you for having us. Great to chat always, and would encourage anybody that's listening who has a question or perspective or wants to debate sponsorship or stock price tips to reach out anytime. We love to just chat about the industry and where it's headed, and any way that we can help out, obviously we're more than happy to. But love connecting with people in the industry and having conversations that certainly open our eyes and help us also evolve what we do and to ensure that it's meeting your needs. So thanks for the time, Brad, and we'll look forward to chatting again soon.
Great, thanks so much, Adam. Have a great day, guys.
Take care, guys.